traveling through Northeast Ohio, make a point of stopping by the Canton Classic Car Museum. They've got a lot of great cars, everything from brass era cars to muscle cars, and they have tons of memorabilia and all kind of automobilia just lining the walls. Everywhere you look, you see something new.
Hello, I'm Gary Pelger. I'm the operations manager here at the Canton Classic Car Museum. Promised Jim a little tour here, so if you'd follow along with us. We'll start in this room, and this room is kind of the main hall where you come in. And because of the door openings we have here, we have the smallest cars available in this room. First one here is a 1916 Woods Mobilette, which is on loan to us from the AACA Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which has yet to be built. So we'll probably have the car for some time till they get their museum built. It's very similar to a Model T Ford, but if you think compact cars are something new, this is proof they're not. It seats two. It has staggered seating because of the narrowness of the car. And another good reason for the staggered seating is you have to crank start this car, and there's no door on that side. It's just an outline of a door if you look at it closely. So, and the Model Ts were built the same way. So the driver has to crawl in through here and past his passenger and get the throttle and the spark set correctly after he's got it crank started. And so that just gives him a little speedier access. Next car was built right in Athens, Ohio, here in Ohio. Some of you people my age can remember these being advertised in Popular Mechanics magazine and Popular Science. It was advertised and touted as the second car. That's right after World War II. Everybody had one car and they were pushing for two cars so the housewife could do her grocery shopping. Where she would have put her groceries in this car is beyond me, because the engine's in the rear and this doesn't open. So she's got one seat beside her for a bag of groceries. That's about it. This is our 1958 Bliss Surrey. Bliss Company was here in Canton, Ohio. And a very interesting story, during the Eisenhower recession in 1958, the company had lost all its orders for big presses, which is basically what Bliss Company was known for. And rather than lay their people off like we hear so much about today, they contracted with another company to build and sell this 1901 Curved Dash Oldsmobile replica. It's 100% the same size as a matter of fact. I can show you another original car in the museum later, but it's a replica. They rolled the steel. They built and sold 500 of these. An Amish buggy factory made the wheels, and even the step plate here was the same thing you'll find on Amish buggies in the area. These sold for about $1,200, and they could come in either kit form or they bring them to you delivered. The options was they could put a back seat on the rear facing out the rear, and there was a Surrey top. I've only seen one car equipped with a Surrey top. I've never seen one with a back seat. But this is our example of one. The museum itself was initiated and started with a private collection of Marsh Belden, who made his fortune in the oil and gas business. Marsh collected big antique cars, and you'll see some of them in a bit. His wife was a little bored with the cars, kind of the same way my wife is, and my wife collects old magazines while I'm looking for car parts. Marsh's wife collected antiques, and as he brought his cars into the building, she brought her things into the building. So everything you see here that's extra in this building is all Mrs. Belden's hobby. This is an extension of her living room is what it is. Marsh passed away about 6 years ago, but Mrs. B is still living, and she comes in 2 or 3 times a week with another station wagon full of antiques that she's picked up somewhere. So the decor is constantly changing in here. We try to rotate cars around. She rotates everything else. She's the true curator of the museum. The second room that you'll see when you come through the museum is what we call the Canton Room. Everything in this room pertains to Canton, Ohio. It's all mostly all Mrs. Belden's collection of, she just loves Canton-related items. If she finds it in a gift shop or an antique shop, she'll purchase this. There's an awful lot of photos. A lot of it is industry-related. Now, if you look in some of the cases here, we have items that were made in Ohio, items related to the Football Hall of Fame, the Canton Repository, the local newspaper. The Timken Company is here in town. Diebold, that makes the safes, is here in town. Whatever we managed to collect has something to do with most of these companies. The interesting thing is the automobile at the end of the room here is the Holmes Automobile. Mr. Holmes was the chief engineer at the Franklin Company in Buffalo, New York, and he hated the weather in Buffalo. And I can understand why. They just had 7 feet of snow about a month ago. But so he came back to Canton, his hometown, and he built a similar automobile to the Franklin. The Franklin was air-cooled, so was his. This car is a Doctor's Coupe. It was made in 1922. The price of a Doctor's Coupe for this particular car was $4,000. And that doesn't sound like much today, but if you put it in perspective, you could buy a new Model T that year for $385. So $4,000, that's probably why he built Doctor's Coupes. They were probably the only people in town who could afford one. And the passenger front seat is really not much more than a stool. It folds up, clear up underneath the dashboard, so that he has to take one of his patients. He's making house calls, understand. If he had to take a patient to the doctor's or to the hospital, you could fold that up and practically lay him out on a stretcher in there. This room we call the cemetery room, strictly because of the hearses in the center of the room. That's a matched set of 1937 Packard hearses that have never been split up since the day they were new. The buttons on the doors would accommodate that particular funeral home's sign that was using it that day. Say it was Smith Funeral Home, they'd have their own sign that would snap on the doors. And when Jones Funeral Home used it the next day, they'd put their sign on it. This is a V12, very, very rare. It's a Miller art carved hearse. It's mahogany panels in the back, and it's a V12 engine. The accompanying flower car is a Super 8, more of a standard job. These are custom bodied by Miller in Ohio. But the V12 Packard will get out on the road and do 80 mile an hour all day long. I don't know who needs to get to a funeral that fast, but it will. In addition, in this room, we do have the Johnny Carson Delorean. This car has not actually been driven any distance at all since Johnny Carson had owned it. We call it the $500,000 DeLorean because Johnny Carson had invested $500,000 in John DeLorean's company, and in return, John gave him this car to drive. When the company went into receivership, the car was repossessed from Johnny, went to an auction, and some local people in Pennsylvania own the car today, and it's on loan here at the museum. Many of the cars at the museum are on loan. Some are owned by the museum, and some of them are still the initial collection of Marsh Belden Sr. This car is what we call barn fresh, and I love to show people this car to see what a restorer sometimes is faced with in the restoration process. This is a 1914 Benham. It came right from Canton, Ohio at Myers Lake. It's been in one family since it was new, and they donated it to the museum. And I think I like it the way it is. I love to show people how solid it was built. This is one of 19 built in Detroit in 1914. There was only 19 cars built. This is probably the only one in existence. I've never heard of a Benham or seen another one. So it's one of the most unique vehicles in the museum. Well, Jim, this is what we call our 50s and 60s room. If you look closely at it, it has a tile floor. This building was put up, I think, erected around 1904. And this was the original showroom for the Monnet and Soccer Ford garage, is what this building started out life as. It was also one of the 6 assembly points for Model T Fords. And the way I understand, Henry Ford was actually in the building. We had a second floor on the building at that time. It burned off later. But on the second floor, they assembled Model T Fords that came in on the local railroad spur. And they brought them down by elevator after they were assembled, and this is where they would have been the showroom where they sold the Fords. Today, it's like I say, our 50s and 60s rooms. We have some of the, I call them the obligatory cars from the 50s, the ones that stick out in your mind of the 50s. We have the big finned Cadillac Eldorado convertible that's probably 18 or so feet long. Got to be one of the biggest Cadillacs ever built. And we have a DeSoto Adventure, which is a much rarer car than the Cadillac would be. the 56 Thunderbird down the line here, the 57 Chevy Bel Air convertible, and then two more unusual cars. We have the Superbird, the 1971, or 1970, I mean, Superbird. That was the type of car Richard Petty raced in the stock car races in those days. This is without a doubt the fastest car in the museum. Matter of fact, it was the very first car sold to the public that would do 200 miles an hour. We have a 1962 Amphicar. It's an amphibious car, amphibious convertible. And I think they all were convertibles, to tell you the truth, but I've never seen a hardtop one. But these actually did float. They actually go in the water, and this one's been in the water plenty of times. Interesting side note with it is this being the Monnet and Soccer Ford garage, and the assembled cars here had their own engineering department. And during World War I, they actually designed and built two prototypes of an Amphicar, which we have pictured here. The bottom picture actually shows the car being tested in Myers Lake here in town. And they actually had a steering wheel on both ends. One was for driving it as a truck, and the other was for driving it in the water. And so the driver would have to run to the other end once they put it in the water. Never actually sold any by the time they got designed, the prototypes built, the war was over. So, one of the things I've learned about these cars, they do float. You can take them in the water. I wouldn't take them in the ocean where the waves are big, or even in Lake Erie where the waves can get big. But for small lakes like Lake Cable around here, Myers Lake, it would work fine. The secret with this car is never dock it. You keep moving. And the front wheels act as the rudders. And when we go around back, you can see the propellers on the back. But they're not that waterlogged. They have two bilge pumps in them because the water will leak up around the shock absorbers. It'll leak in through the doors a little bit. So they're constantly running a bilge pump. And I happen to know a story on this very particular car. The man lent it to his son. He was visiting friends at Lake Cable. And they called him in for lunch, and he docked it. Instead of driving it up on shore, he left it at the dock. When he came out, he thought the car had been stolen. Then he looked down and saw it was underwater. So probably quite a few of these have sunk in their day and been dug back up. That's more like how they float. You can see the water's going to run right through here, just below the belt line. We've actually entered this car in the boat show a couple of times here in town. This is a 37 Packard Limousine. It's in our main room. This is the room where you'll see the big antique classic cars. And I call that classic with a capital C because a lot of us think of 57 Chevy Bel Airs as classics, and they're not actually on the list of true classics. So I call those classics with a small c. This is a classic with a big C. This is a very unusual limousine. I wanted to point a couple things out to you. This limousine is one of two built by the Packard Company in 1937. Now, it's rumored that one was built for Franklin Roosevelt. This one, I know, was built for a Colorado rancher who was a paraplegic. And it's called an invalid car because they referred to them as invalids in those days. This car has a built-in wheelchair. There's also a ramp that came from the factory that fastens right on this lip. And the chair unlocks. It locks into position while you're driving. It just snaps free there, and you can wheel that wheelchair out. The other unusual feature for a limousine is it has a split front seat. And this seat will lift right out of the car. And this center post is actually removable. And until I worked here, I'd never seen anything like it, but it's got two thumb screws back here. You can take this whole post out, put a stretcher victim in the car, put the post back in, and you're ready to roll. Generals actually drove limousines like this in World War II. I've seen the 38 Cadillac, for instance, with the same arrangement so that they could put stretchers in there because the general's cars would sometimes have to double for medics. And that was the reason for those. It's a fun car to drive. Packards, I've found from working here, are probably, as antiques go, the most drivable car. Actually drives like an automobile, whereas some of the big Lincolns and Pierce Arrows drive more like driving a semi-truck. They're heavy. They've got V8s, V12s, V16s in some cases. They don't steer as well. The bigger the engine, the more power the car has, but they didn't have power steering in those days, and you can really build up some arms driving these things. Okay, this is probably, in my opinion, the most beautiful car ever designed. It was designed by Gordon Brewery, who worked at the time for the Auburn Cord Duesenberg factory. This is a 1937 supercharged Cord Fenton convertible. It was designed strictly with the Hollywood crowd in mind. It probably retailed at not that much in today's standards, but it was around $3,000 to $4,000 range with the supercharger and everything on it. Probably one of the fastest cars ever built in that day and age. Had a lot of trouble. It was the first car with disappearing headlights. If you'll notice the headlights down here on either side. I don't know if you can see them with the mannequins in front of it, but they mold right into the fender. A lot of cars do that today that are vacuum operated. This one actually has one crank for each headlight on each side of the dashboard. It's also front wheel drive, and it gave a lot of trouble to people that owned them in the 30s. It was the first front wheel drive car, and it was never really quite perfected. As a matter of fact, when the Cord Company went out of business in the mid-30s, this was the last year the car was built, the dies went to both Graham and Hupmobile, and into the 40s they were still making cars designed like this. And I would imagine the Graham or the Hupmobile were actually easier to operate because underneath they were just a standard car, whereas this had a lot of engineering innovations, which is what makes it the true classic. This is a 31 Lincoln Judkins Berline design. Rather than standard from the factory, a lot of cars were custom built in those days at certain shops. The Lincoln Company or the Packard or any of the big companies would send these cars. And this was done at the Judkins Berline factory. And if you'll notice the touches that a special coach builder will put on, I think on this car especially, is the windshield. It's a split V-shaped windshield. It actually points forward. It really gives us a touch of class. The car's done in different shades of burgundy. Probably with the lighting you can't really tell, but outdoors it's quite a sight to see. And by comparison, this is a mechanically restored 32 Lincoln. It's a Dietrich body, but it still carries a very similar windshield. And that's an awfully long car that seats two people. Next car in line is a V16 Cadillac convertible sedan, 4 doors. It's a unique experience to drive a 16-cylinder car. They're very powerful. They're not fast as we consider cars today because they're just not geared that way, but you can pull tree stumps with these things. Okay, we've probably all seen one of these cars before. If you think about it, it's a 1907 Renault Town Car, very similar to the car that was used in the Titanic movie. I think just about everyone's seen the movie. Some of these cars, they didn't change body style much. And there are some on the bottom of the ocean on the Titanic. They were shipped from England and they were coming to the United States. These were the limousines of their day. This is what's really unique about this car is it belonged to the president of Chile. It's very low mileage, original. This car has never been restored, with the exception, I would guess, that the seats have been redone in the front, but they definitely have not been done in the back. And that's the original cloth interior. The window, of course, comes down on the front there, and my lady would drive in the back and speak to the driver through that horn. And there's just tell him turn right, pull over, you know, that sort of thing. You want to stop at the millinery shop or whatever. And it's just a beautiful car and in fantastic condition when you consider its age, approaching 100 years in the next 5 years. So it's 95 years old. And to find a car in this condition after that length of time, the best you can normally hope for is the Benham that we discussed earlier. This is another car that's on loan to the museum. It's a 1906 Rio, R-E-O, and if you were familiar with that, that's Ransom Eli Oldsmobile, or Olds, I should say. He started the Oldsmobile, sold it to what later became General Motors in like 1903 or 4, and started his own factory building the Rio automobile. Rio ran right into the 30s, I think probably the most unusual thing about it is its companion here. And the companion is a factory-built 1/2 scale Renault Automobile they use for promotional events. And took a long search for the owner of these cars to find this car. But he'd been on a long search for it. He restored it just to match the big one. They're really unique. The big car, I'm only guessing, but I would guess is maybe worth $40,000, $50,000 in that range. This car, being one of a kind, built by the factory, and a running automobile, 1/2 scale, everything, it has to be priceless. Nobody could put a price on it. I do own a Volkswagen I have enough trouble getting into, so I don't think I'll try to drive this one. This is a photograph from 1906 when the car debuted at Madison Square Garden. It's being driven by a team of midgets, Tiny Tim at the wheel. A lot of people think that's Tom Thumb, but Tom Thumb died in the 1850s, so it'd be kind of hard to have behind the wheel, even of a car this old. As a scale, here's a normal-sized adult man of the year, and here's the giant from the circus. And he was probably 7 foot something. It's probably rather common today. This car is the most recent addition to the museum. We just picked it up at Hershey last October at the fall show. It's a 1936 Chrysler Airflow. Very unpopular in its day. The public wasn't ready to accept this, but it is unique because it's the first car that was designed in a wind tunnel where someone actually took into consideration the coefficient of drag to improve mileage and speed and everything else. And reduce friction. This is probably the biggest model, being the Chrysler, of the Airflows. And by comparison, it's kind of neat to look at a 36 Lincoln here. This was Mr. and Mrs. Belden's honeymoon car. This is probably one that'll never leave the museum. It's a beautiful car by any standards, but this is what the people were used to seeing in 1936 rather than the Chrysler Airflow, and it was just a little too wild for them to accept at that time. Matter of fact, their favorite name for this car was the Potato Bug. This is a very rare grain truck. It's a farm truck. It was used for hauling grain on a farm in Iowa. What's really rare about it is it's an Oldsmobile truck. And yes, for a few years, Oldsmobile did make trucks. And this is a 1919 Oldsmobile truck. And recently I was watching a rerun of The Grapes of Wrath with Henry Fonda on television. If you remember the old beat-up truck that they were driving in that movie, I just was astounded to realize it was a 1919 Oldsmobile as well, one just like this. Canton in 1937 bought 3 brand new fire trucks, all identical, Aaron's Fox. This is the unrestored one. The fire department still owns a totally restored one, and the third one gave up its life for parts for these two. So. But this is a running fire truck, but it could use a restoration. But it's kind of unique to see it just the way it sits. Okay, both of these cars, the red Metropolitan is a 1959, and the yellow Isetta is a 1957. And they're a local celebrity TV guy here in Channel 8 in Cleveland. Neil Zerker does his one-tank trips in these cars, and he travels all over Michigan, New York, Indiana, and Ohio. West Virginia, and that's why he needs these cars to make them on one tank. But he always comes on television, tells you a neat place to visit or a neat restaurant to eat at or bed and breakfast to stay at, you know. And said it was the most dangerous thing he's ever driven in his life. It can't get out of its own way. It only does about 35 miles an hour. If a semi-truck rolls up beside you, you're the same size as the tire, you know, in there. And that's how you get in. The gear shift is on the left-hand side. This little tube here is your defroster. They weren't into luxury. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for visiting the museum. Wind up here in the gift shop area. We have books and models and things that are car-related for sale to the public. And I'd like to encourage your viewers to come and visit us. We're open 7 days a week from 10 to 5, so we're here every day. With the exception of Christmas morning. They'll let us go home and open our presents, and then we'll be back. But we're, like I say, 7 days a week, 10 to 5, and right downtown Canton at 6th and Market South.